Welcome very much. It's good to see all of you virtually. Our topic today is the publisher's viewpoint, which I am curious to find out as an author. I'm eager to get insights from the other side of the editing process. And unfortunately, one of our panelists had to drop out at the last minute, but we still have a crackerjack panel with Mary Conley and Emily Cunningham. Let me just make a quick note here, which is feel free to ask questions. You can either text them in the chat room, or you can raise your hand, and there's a reaction, should be a reactions icon at the bottom of your screen where you can raise your hand, and then I will recognize you towards after we launch into a conversation ourselves. Mary and Emily were kind enough to send me their bios, appropriately enough for the bio conference. But instead of extrapolating from what's important from their biography, I'm going to ask them to, since I'm assuming that they're greater experts on themselves than I am, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their background, and maybe tell us how you got into publishing.
Should we go in ABC order, Emily? Should I go first?
Please, Mary.
Okay. All right.
You guys can
thank
fight
you,
for the
Max.
honor.
Thank you, Max, and thank you to Bio for having us. This is an exciting conference to be a part of. So a bit of background on myself. I'm actually not a lit major, an English major. I went to grad school for Greek art and archaeology at the University of Missouri. And upon graduating, realized, what do you do with a master's degree in Greek art and archaeology? But I was lucky enough to fall into an editorial assistant position at the University of Missouri Press. That was in 2013. So that's where I started learning the publishing ropes, at least from the academic publisher standpoint. And then after about 4 years, moved up to associate acquisitions editor, and that's where I am now. Very happily working for University of Missouri. In addition to biographies and autobiographies, we publish a range of titles. We work on military history, general US history, Black studies, literature and literary criticism, and some others I'm sure I'm forgetting. But I will pass it over to Emily.
Can I just ask, before we pass it to Emily, can I just ask a very naive question?
Oh, sure.
Is there a difference between an acquisitions editor and a different kind of editor?
The acquisitions editor, we do the initial evaluation of proposals, or we go out scouting for books that we'd like to see written. And so, our inbox is full of proposals that we're always evaluating. And when we find projects that we like, we typically do a developmental edit along with the author. And then it would go out to peer review, which is also a process that we're in charge of. And then, I can talk about this more in depth when we're discussing.
We'll talk about it in a minute, but okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Emily?
Hi. Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Max. And thanks to Bio for having me on the panel. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm a senior editor at Penguin Press, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And I do the occasional work of fiction, but really my focus is on nonfiction across a variety of different genres, including biography and also history, memoir, narrative journalism, science, all sorts of nonfiction for a general readership. And I've been at Penguin Press since 2015. And my first few jobs in publishing were at Grove Atlantic and HarperCollins. So I've had a number of different experiences in trade publishing, and really excited for the conversation.
Great. Well, if you're talking to an audience of authors from your vantage point as an editor, what's the number one thing or the top few things that you want to tell authors? What strikes you as being the most important pieces of advice from your perspective that you can give? We can reverse the order. Emily, you want to go first?
Sure. I guess I would say to any aspiring or current biographer that, and any current biographer knows this, is that a subject of your biography is a person you're going to spend many, many months and years with. And every biographer I've worked with has reached a point of incurable obsession, which is easily recognized and very exciting for an editor to be in the presence of. And when I'm evaluating potential projects, whether they're biographies or any other type of nonfiction, I'm always looking for that kind of magical match of author and subject, and why the reason, whether it's personal or scholarly or whatever the case may be, why that author and that subject feel fated, feel perfectly paired. And yeah, that's a very exciting feeling. So I think any biography that I guess probably we would be talking about in this space usually comes with a backstory, with some kind of seed of that obsession, which is part of the story of the editor's acquisition and eventually the editor's pitch, because it's my job, of course, not just to work editorially with the author, but then also to sort of tell the story of the biography and usher it into the world and sort of be there for it to meet the world. And a big part of that salesmanship is about that sort of love affair, if you will, between biographer and subject. So there really are two pieces to the editor's job, three pieces: the acquisition, the editing, and the sales element of it, but they're all really linked by that relationship.
I want to delve a little bit more deeply into the editor's job in a second, but Mary, you want to answer?
Yeah,
as
you
well?
probably saw me nodding my head along a lot. I think that link between the author and their subject is definitely a key component. When someone's enthusiastic about their subject and that transfers from the page, to whoever's reading it, that's a big key factor. I think another important consideration always is why. Why does this story matter? Who is it going to reach out to? Is always something we're thinking about as editors. And for biography especially, if you're perhaps writing on someone who has had past biographies, finding maybe something new, like a new resource that someone hadn't considered before. For instance, we had a book recently last year about General Patton. I mean, there's plenty of books about General Patton out there, but he was focusing in on specifically the war years, and he was looking at some resources that maybe past biographers hadn't looked at, in the sense that he was rummaging around for soldiers' accounts of what they remembered of the general. Whenever you can add new perspectives like that, that always helps when you're trying to bring it to the attention of an editor. So yeah, I think anytime you have this discovery of a new archive or letters that people hadn't uncovered before, definitely bring that to the attention in your proposal.
How about any? And I'm going to put you two on the spot here, but any pet peeves with authors?
I mean, one of the red flag words that we have around our office is when someone says their work is unique. I mean, nothing's unique. It's all been done under the sun in some ways. So, but I think kind of as what Emily was alluding to, if you explain why you're the perfect author for this subject, I think that really helps. And for me, I guess another red flag would be when an author hasn't really considered issues of permission, and that's a whole other subject we could get into.
What do you mean by
Are
issues
they
of
going to be
permission?
able to access the necessary people and archives for the work that they want to do? I'd say already have that under consideration or a plan laid out beforehand before you approach publishers.
I'm always, I guess maybe to frame it slightly more positively than a pet peeve, I'm always encouraged when a prospective author has really thought about where their biography fits in, both to the existing scholarship on that particular subject and also to the era that that subject occupied or the community that that person was part of. I think a pet peeve might be when an author announces him or herself as the first or the only, sort of like what you were saying, Mary, as opposed to sort of contributing to an ongoing conversation, which if the subject is worth that scope of discussion, that conversation will continue. And there'll be future authors to build on that discussion. So sort of awareness of that ongoing body of work and what perhaps needs correcting or updating, what sort of scholarly traditions bear a closer look. That's always exciting to see.
One question I have is, how important is it for the book to break a lot of new ground? And I would guess that there would be a difference between academic and commercial publishers. But let me start with Emily, since you're a representative of the commercial publishing world. But just looking at biographies that sell, they usually, correct me if I'm wrong, but they usually tend to be of very famous people, and they don't necessarily break a vast amount of new ground. I mean, if you think about how many biographies there have been of like Washington, Lincoln, Grant, Napoleon, very Nixon, very familiar figures, John F. Kennedy, others. And of course, among literary figures as well, the leading authors tend to attract 1 million literary biographers. There's kind of a sense that, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of get the sense that a lot of ordinary readers don't really care if what they're reading is actually all that new or different from anything else that's been written. They just want a new story, and there's kind of a bias, I think, in academia, which is not necessarily wrong, but I think the academic, and I remember just, many moons ago, as a one-time grad student myself, there's a tendency to say, you have to break new scholarly ground, but does that really matter for commercial publishing?
I think there's I would pick out a phrase that you use, which is kind of a new story. I think certainly it's always very tantalizing to be able to say there's a new archive that's just opened up, and this new book is going to capitalize on what we're taking from that new archive, to Mary's point. But I think often in the absence of necessarily new hard information or new resources, there can be new perspective, whether that's something that the author brings to the table, or a new kind of way of situating the subject's life in a particular tradition or a particular community or a particular context that feels fresh, even if there aren't necessarily bombshell revelations that are just surfacing. I published a book last year, a biography of Helen Frankenthaler, who's been much written about, and just quite recently there had been a group biography of a number of female painters, 9th Street Women, which included Frankenthaler. And the approach of Alex Nemiroff, who's my author, who's a brilliant art historian, was to write a sort of different kind of biography that was not a kind of soup to nuts, comprehensive doorstopper, but really focused on the first 10 years of her life. When she was just out of college, she was moving to New York. She was attempting to break into this community of mostly male painters who were really determining, setting what was exciting in the art world at that time. And that was what we were sort of pitching, was that fresh approach to looking at the life and development of an artist and the relationship between the life and the times. And so we didn't have to say, oh, this new revelation about how this painting was created, but we can say this is a slightly different story about a woman in a man's world and this particular community at this particular time. So I do think there is pressure to frame from a publicity perspective what might be new in many different senses of the word, to draw in, the editor, the producer of the, big publicity that we're seeking, as opposed to just, you've heard of this person, they're famous. If you're interested in this person, you'll like this book. But it can take lots of different forms.
Yeah, just to, I guess, add the academic press approach to it sometimes. I mean, certainly we have published biographies and histories of people who they have several books written about them. We have a Mark Twain list that continues to get proposals. There's always something to be said about Twain, I suppose. But I think to Emily's point, when you can frame it as a new story or maybe a new perspective that hadn't really been considered about this particular person before, I think that's always a pretty good key selling point with publishers. We had a book last year on Tennessee Williams. Obviously he's had biographies written before or works focusing on his plays. But this one was specifically looking at the influence of St. Louis on his life and how that then translated into his creative life. He famously hated St. Louis. He did not like growing up there. And people most often associate him with New Orleans in the South. But Henry Schwee, the author, was able to draw out how this kind of miserable existence and his rough family life then was appearing in his works, and kind of offered a new interpretation of a lot of his early works. So if you can find kind of that kernel that makes the story a bit different, that's always going to help when proposing a work to publishers. And then some of my favorite biographies that I've worked on have been almost, I don't want to say experimental exactly, but quite a bit different. We had a book called The Names of John Gergen. And John Gergen was a immigrant from the Danube region who came to St. Louis. And the author, Ben Moore, ended up working on this book. He was actually dumpster diving in St. Louis, and he came across these old yellowed school book pages from 1914. And it was John Gergen's homework assignments for about a year. And that was his jumping off point to research, what can I find out about the life of this person, who was an immigrant in early 20th century America? What must his life have been like? So it was a biography, but it was also a social history of the region, and kind of a very interesting portrait of the ways that, American citizens were trying to Americanize these immigrant groups, but also the ways that these immigrant groups in St. Louis were maintaining their home identities. So, the biographies that we accept can be a range. It's not only famous people.
It occurs to me while you two are talking, you introduced yourselves. I never actually introduced myself. So let me just very briefly introduce myself, and then that'll actually segue into the next question. I'm a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a research organization. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, and I'm also, an author. I've started off in military history writing, and then have segued into biography, and wrote a book about Ed Lansdale, the legendary covert operative in the Vietnam War, and in the midst right now of writing a new biography of Ronald Reagan, and all of that is for Bob Weil at Liveright at Norton. But that's kind of segues into my next question, Mary, which is just for you, which is that, although I've never written for an academic press, working for a quasi-academic institution like the Council on Foreign Relations, we do go through an academic peer review process where our manuscripts are sent out not by the publisher, but by the institution for feedback from generally a couple of academics. And I have to say, quite candidly, I have not found the feedback to be very useful. A lot of it just consists, frankly, of nitpicking in my estimation. I'm curious for your view of the academic peer review process. Does it work well? How important is it? What difference does it make in your deliberations?
Yeah, so yes, I think it's always a good idea if you are considering an academic press and say an academic press editor is interested, you feel free to ask them questions early about how their academic review process works. I think it's fairly standard among most academic university presses, but for us, for instance, once your manuscript is accepted, and then your author will usually edit it and work with you. And then we will typically ask the author if they have any ideas about potential outside reviewers, but it's usually us, the press editors, who will choose the people who to send it to. But it is nice for you to submit to us names of people who, have worked on similar topics, who might be experts in the person or era that you're working on. So, because that's how we normally decide who to send it to. And for me, certainly you do get those peer reviews back that are a bit nitpicky, but other times they can be very helpful, sometimes in terms of simple issues like organization. Also, an outside reviewer can help you maybe realize areas where you're going on a bit too long about X, Y, and Z. You really need to trim up this chapter. And I'm trying to think. I had one specific book that was kind of a group biography, and the author herself was actually related to one of the families in the biography. And the peer reviewer, one of them pointed out that she wasn't being very objective about a few things. I think the fact that she was related to one of the subjects was sort of getting in the way. And unfortunately, we had to end up dropping that project because she, was not receptive to the feedback that had been given to her. So generally, I think the peer review process is important and useful to all parties, not just the press, but to the authors themselves. And for us, usually our reviews will come back and they'll have some good suggestions. And based on those reviews, I work with my author to come up with a plan for revision. What are we going to address? What do you think doesn't need addressing? And in most cases, we will then present the project to what's called our editorial board. Sometimes they're called a faculty board, and usually made up of professors or people on a university campus. And then the board will vote to approve or not approve a project based on our presentation to them. All our board members will have access to the outside reviewers' reports, and we go from there. Typically, we don't take anything to the editorial board that we don't think will, pass. So that's how the process usually works.
Let me ask you, Emily, kind of the flip side of that. of that question, which is obviously in commercial publishing, there is no academic review. So, and you know, you're publishing books in a wide variety of topics, and there's no way one person could possibly be expert in all of them. So, you know, how do you know that the author is right? How do you know the author gets their facts right? How do you know they're not just making stuff up or BSing or just saying stuff that is nonsensical to, or would be considered nonsensical to experts in the field that might sound completely plausible to a lay reader? I mean, how do you, what's I guess my question is, what's your BS detector?
Well, you've identified every trade editor's worst nightmare, which is which is being sold fabricated material by a so-called expert. But
I mean, it doesn't even have to be fabricated. It could
no,
just
no, no.
be like wrong in some respects, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I couldn't possibly be a reasonable fact checker for my authors, though I think you know, the first step comes at the acquisition process when a author is submitting a proposal, and you know, you can evaluate their credentials, whether it's the person's scholarly background or their experience with a particular subject. Often that proposal will come with endorsements of some kind from their peers, whether it's journalists or academics or other people in their professional space. But a lot of it does come down to personal trust, and you meet with your author before you sign a contract, and you hear them. You know, usually those meetings are an hour, sometimes more, and they can be pretty intense. And you know, one of my authors once compared that meeting to dissertation defense meets blind date, which is to say they're trying to impress you and you them, but a big part of what the author is trying to do is demonstrate their credibility on that material. And so you do go into the relationship with the benefit of that foundation. But when it comes to the manuscript, there are a few checks on the process. There's my read of multiple drafts. Usually, while there's no peer review process, it's very common that an author I work with will seek reads from folks in their field, whatever the case may be, to just not as any mandated part of the process, but just for support. And especially if one chapter is sort of out of their immediate arena of expertise and they've been seeking the counsel of some, you know, person who knows a lot more about it, maybe they'll have the person read that chapter to say, did I get everything right here? Or are there any, you know, checks you want to make? We have copy editors who often are another good sort of BS detector to back up my work by saying, this doesn't totally make sense to me, or, you know, if there's some way that I've lost the thread, having read the draft several times, our copy editors sometimes point out those things. And then we have pre-publication blurbers who often, even as they're in the process of considering something as a means most likely to support the publication with an endorsement, they also often come back with really useful comments, you know, saying, I really enjoyed this book. I got a lot out of it.
Wait a second, you're telling me that blurbers actually read the books?
Every once in a while, it seems they do. But I have had really useful comments come out of those reads. So I don't count on them. I can't sort of count that blurbers will you know, do my BS detection for me, but sometimes it can be a useful part of the process. So and we also do legal reviews on nonfiction manuscripts that we think merit that kind of closer look from a legal perspective. So all that is to say, we have various checks, but we don't have that kind of scholarly review, and it's a leap of faith to a certain extent in the end.
And how much, for both of you, how much editing do you actually do? I mean, how much time do you have for editing, I guess, because you have all these other responsibilities, including acquisition and marketing and all that other stuff. So how much time do you actually have to kind of sit around and mark up a manuscript? Are you finding yourself crunched for that kind of time?
It's often a time crunch. I will admit to, if it's an experienced author and I'm liking the first half of the book, I might not check all the way of the manuscript, and I'll let the peer reviewers take up some of the slack there. But typically, if it is a book going to press, I will read the whole thing and go over it and make notes for the author, comments, questions. Like Emily was saying, if you're unsure about certain parts, that's the time to hopefully clear the air at that stage. But yeah, it's tough. I kind of break my day into certain chunks where I'm just reading. I'm not looking at email right now. But yeah, it's always a struggle, right, Emily?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time editing, and unlike on the academic side, I'm really it in terms of the House editorial response. So when I finish my work on a manuscript and it goes through to production, which is to say we are, saying pencils down on the editorial work and it starts the process of becoming a book, I'm sometimes the only person who's read it, and which is a very humbling feeling. And hopefully maybe there are some others putting their mind to it, whether it's the author's friends or colleagues or whatever it might be. But it's something that, needless to say, I just have to make the time for. And I do wear a lot of other hats in my job. And when I'm finished with the editing, a whole other element of my job begins, which is to make sure that the book meets the marketplace in the most favorable way possible. But if I haven't done the most thorough and committed editorial work possible, that's going to be an unfavorable meeting of the market. So all editors would say you just have to find the time, and often that's outside of work hours, and that's a fact of the job.
Yeah,
but
I always dread when people ask me, what do you read for fun? I'm like, I read for work. I don't.
Well, we have obviously a great audience, and they're asking some very good questions. So I want to, although I can keep firing away here, but I want to go to the audience questions because they're very good. So let me start with at the beginning here. Elizabeth Renker asks, what is your preferred format for a proposal? How do authors get one to you, and is getting an agent part of the process?
Well, I guess if you don't mind, Emily, I can go first because we don't work with agents typically at our press. Authors are welcome to submit proposals to us. I would say if you're considering academic press, always go to their website because pretty much everyone nowadays has their proposal guidelines stated, or they have even automatic forms that you fill out to submit a proposal. For our press, for example, ours is fairly standard. You basically write a cover letter explaining what your project is about. And then part of that proposal also is an annotated table of contents, a few lines, what is each chapter about? And I think this point was mentioned earlier, you should also speak to the market for the book. Has this topic been discussed before? What are some comparable works? Always mention that in your proposal to show that you know a bit about the subject and what else is out there, but how yours is different. And then I always like to have the introduction and at least one or two sample chapters from the work itself. Please, 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 I think most publishers will tell you this, do not send me the full manuscript, especially for the initial proposal, unless it's something that I have specifically, gone out to recruit. I always love intro and sample chapters as part of the proposal. So.
Yeah, I would echo Mary in terms of the elements that I like to see in a proposal. An outline is really crucial. And I find it's actually a really useful exercise for the author as well, because that's when the rubber really meets the road in terms of thinking about the whole arc of the book and how you're going to pace the narrative and pace the research that you have. The what goes in chapter 8 question is a really important question to wrap your mind around sooner rather than later, as opposed to just sort of, this is a monumental life. Of course, there's going to be so much to say, and it'll just obviously make sense where everything goes once I start writing. Having that feel for the shape of the story and being able to demonstrate that to a publisher is really important. I love seeing sample material too. If you are a writer who's already published either a book, or if you're a journalist who's already published, has a body of work that I could go look up, you probably have more leeway to get away with not including that, but it's always helpful to see what the writing is going to be like on the line level and the storytelling, and the marketplace considerations as well that Mary spoke to. On the trade publishing side, when it comes to agents, it's really the opposite, which is to say it's very rare that I would take on a project that didn't come with an agent attached or that wasn't submitted to me by an agent. I don't think I've signed up a book in my time at Penguin Press that didn't come from an agent. So
why is that? Is that just because agents act as kind of a sorting process for you?
That's a big part of it for sure. A big part of my job is building relationships with those folks such that they know what kinds of projects I'm looking for, what types of books Penguin Press does well. And I think it's really to the benefit of the author, because first of all, the terms that authors receive from at least the major corporate publishers have been negotiated to death. And so an agent isn't going, such that there's really boilerplate terms in terms of royalties and whatnot. And all of that is to the author's advantage. And I think an agent, I work with many brilliant agents who editorially make a huge difference in the conception of a project before publishers consider it. And agents are, really know their way around good proposals. They know what's selling in the marketplace to publishers, and what's sold recently, at what level. They're really going to be, they'll know which editors around town are going to respond favorably to your work because they've published this or that book. I mean, that's really their job to know. So I think it's it's hugely worth it for authors to work with agents. And it just means that you're much likelier to have a sort of love match with the editors that you meet, as opposed to just kind of Googling around and trying to find editors who you think might respond to your work. So that's my pitch for getting an agent.
Next question from Marion Orr. What does it take for a proposal of a biography of a, quote, hidden figure to get the attention of commercial publishers? How do you think about it when deciding? For example, a few years ago, Bio had a roundtable on the difficulties of publishing biographies of Black Americans. The general theme of the roundtable is that commercial publishers are seldom interested because they are concerned about lack of sales and crossover appeal, especially to white readership. The accountants and the marketing departments play a big role as another theme of the roundtable. What do you think?
Maybe I'll kick off, since maybe this is mostly
I think that you is you.
Trade publishing, yeah. Well, I think I would have been interested to hear that roundtable a few years ago. I think as Mary and I just spoke to, thinking about the last question, looking at books that have succeeded ahead of yours is a huge basis for acquisition for any book. When I want to take on a book, whether it's a biography or anything else, I have to go to my bosses and the accountants, of course, and say, this is a book that's come before that's ideally been hugely successful, and this is the this is the comparable title for this book.
You basically have to say that this book is completely different from anything that's ever been published, but exactly like something that sold a lot of copies.
Precisely, precisely. It's that one's completely singular and like this big bestseller that that we've just published. And there are a number of junctures further downstream in the publishing process that rely on that comparable title as well. When I'm pitching books I'm publishing to the sales force for the first time, those comparable titles are hugely important to get their enthusiasm as well. And they use those when they meet booksellers. So that is, like it or not, very much a framework for the publishing process. But I think that there's a lot of space for editorial passion. And at least at Penguin Press, where I'm lucky enough to work, if there's something that really is a novel approach that I haven't encountered before, and that's really just energizing me and I'm having a strong response to that, if the author can make the case for why this entirely distinctive subject or perspective is going to be meeting its moment in 2 or 3 years, whatever the case may be, when we're going to be publishing that book, that counts for a lot. So Hidden Figures, I would say, actually are enjoying a really fruitful moment in commercial publishing at the moment. I think there's a lot of energy right now for restorative history, elevating forgotten figures in history to their rightful attention. And I think the main burden or opportunity for the author in a proposal, and then for the editor as she's positioning that work in-house, is to just make the strongest case possible for why that restoration is urgently important right now. But when that case is sound and straightforward to make, it's some of the most exciting publishing we can do, because, going back to the beginning of our conversation, publishing another biography of a, American president who's had multiple biographies written, is worthy and something we do all the time at Penguin Press. But to introduce readers to someone new is it's really thrilling. So I think it all kind of comes together in the proposal, in the argument, in the claim that the author is really making for why readers need to know about this person. And that's a lot of where that editorial love match comes from, is if the editor immediately kind of jumps on board with that mission.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with Emily that I think there has been a recent trend that more and more in trade, not just academic books, you are seeing a bit more of these hidden figure stories that are coming out. And I would encourage anyone with one of those type of projects, if it doesn't work out in trade, definitely try the university presses too. One of my favorite books that I worked on was the life partner of the French author Marguerite Yourcenar. And, in most biographies of Marguerite, this woman, Grace Frick, was just, kind of in the background, but she had her own really interesting life. And I remember I had to work, it was hard to make a case to my boss, but I did it. I was like, this is a worthy project. We have to do it. So again, I think don't be afraid to approach trade publishers, but also, you also have academic publishers who would be interested in those types of works also.
Let me ask, we have a couple of questions about the economics of the book business, and one is specifically for Mary on the economics of academic presses. This is from Gretchen Dykstra. Is it true that they shoot for 1,000 to 2,000 sales, and to that end, are some academic presses, quote unquote, richer than others and can spend more money on promotion? And then let me throw another question, this one from Patty Bender, into the mix. What is the critical number of potential sales that tips the scales in favor of or against a proposal? And obviously for both of you, but start, Mary, with the academic press question.
Sales are, as a nonprofit press, we always are hoping for as many sales as we can, but in the more realistic side, as a smaller academic press, you know, a lot of our books see sales between 500 and 1,000, you know, sometimes more if they're paperback and hardcover. You know, a lot of academic presses release hardcover and paperback at the same time. Our typical formula had been to release the hardcover first and then the paperback a year later, but we are now looking to do more simultaneous paperback, hardback release. Definitely it helps if you're going with an academic publisher, and you know, we essentially do not offer advances like you might receive with a commercial publisher. The smaller academic presses just do not have the budget for that. I'm sure it's a different story if you're at Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, you know, some of the bigger academic houses. So if you are publishing a biography and you're expecting a lot of travel expenses to get to archives and such, I'm afraid to say it, but it will probably be on your dime. Now, there are opportunities out there. I think as members of Bio, there are resources that you can consult, scholarships and funds. Those are certainly helpful. If, you know, a resource that I often recommend is your state historical society. Sometimes they'll have grants and subventions that they can offer to authors, particularly ones that are using specific archives at their state historical society. In general, you know, if you're working on maybe a Native American subject, research your options, see if there are Native American societies who might have funding opportunities. You really have to be kind of a sleuth to find these grants and subventions. I always try and help my authors as best I can with that kind of stuff. If you are part of a university, you know, on faculty, obviously sometimes there's funding opportunities through your department. So a lot of our authors take advantage of that. As far as sales considerations though, you know, I would say if you're going with an academic publisher, the most important part to help with your sales and help convince your editor is to show them that you're a good self-marketer. You know, show me that you have a plan. Do you have a website? Are you active on Twitter? You know, I guess maybe now TikTok is the thing. I've seen people doing, you know, book reviews on TikTok. I think as long as you can show how enthusiastic you are about how to get the word out about your book, showing your editor that you know the professional organizations or the literary organizations that would have an interest in this topic. If you can show me that in your proposal, that's always a great advantage.
And for my part, I mean, we do pay advances. There's no critical number for sales that would, you know, give us a yes or no answer. But I think it's, you know, the advance is a function of two things. One are the sales hopes and dreams we can pin on a book, and also the competitive marketplace that we're staring down when a number of different publishers want to publish a book. But there's a we do have to answer to our corporate overlords who are paying our salaries, and at Penguin Press, where we're trying to publish serious nonfiction for a broad audience, it can be tough. But everything Mary says goes in terms of on the commercial side as well, in terms of being that messenger for your book, and being as sort of outwardly facing as possible. But when we go through the process of acquiring a book, we're looking at the whole marketplace, comparable books, as I said, what the author's background is and what they can bring to the project in terms of connections and promotion. And also it's a question of fit. You know, are we the best publisher for this book? Are our marketing and publicity teams really sort of know what to do with this book, and know how to get it to the readers that are waiting for it? There's books that we pass on all the time that are worthy, but we just think another publisher that has a slightly different focus might do better with it. So those are all parts of our calculus as we consider projects, not so much, not least because we can't predict what a book is going to sell, but also because we could feel a project was completely worthwhile and we'd be very happy to publish at a lower sales point, as long as we go into it with those expectations, which are reflected in the advance and are just kind of broader plan for the publication.
There's a question from Kai, which I'm gathering is specifically for Emily. And the question is, if Simon & Schuster is acquired by Penguin, will SNS be able to bid against Penguin imprints? And beyond that very specific question, let me just throw out a broader question about what has been the impact of corporate consolidation on publishing?
The answer to Kai's question is yes. We've been assured, as have the agents, the agent community, who, needless to say, have a lot to say about a potential merger, that Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House imprints will remain completely editorially independent and able to bid against each other. Probably the less said for me about the details of the merger, the better. But before I came to Penguin Press in 2015, 2 years prior was the Penguin and Random House merger, which was similarly to this prospective merger that we're looking at now, caused a big hubbub in the business and a lot of hand-wringing about advances. Random House and Penguin imprints were assured that they would be able to bid against each other, and that's gone on in the last decade. And I love many of my counterparts on the Random House side, but they're my competitor. I think of them as my competitors, as that's how it really plays out more often than not. So that is the message that we have received so far, is that process will continue should the merger go through, which is something I truly have no insight into whatsoever. So.
Of course. And what about kind of the larger impact of corporate consolidation on publishing?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked at 3 very different publishers. Grove Atlantic is a very small independent publisher, and HarperCollins and Penguin Random House are 2 of the big 5, and more sort of corporate feel. But the key to the way publishing functions, and has for a long time, is the smaller scale of the imprint, which are the subdivisions of a particular corporate publisher, Penguin Press in my case. And Penguin Press is quite small. We publish about 45 or 50 books a year, and we very much have our own publishing focus and sensibility and budget, and we're our own sort of bubble within the broader corporate structure. So on a day-to-day basis, in my job as an editor, working with authors, advocating for projects, pushing those books out into the world, I benefit immensely from the sort of distribution and sales muscle of being at a big publisher, but my immediate sort of creative environment is very focused and specific, and that's, I think, what allows good publishing to continue. Is if you feel like it's about anything other than your work with the authors and making the books the best they can be, you feel really kind of disconnected from at least why I got into the business. And so I don't really perceive that kind of corporate machinery on a day-to-day basis. And I do think at PRH, in the in the wake of the 2013 merger, a lot of very careful attention was paid to maintaining the identity of those individual publishers, because that's what really those brands, to use a very 2022 term, I think really are important for putting the books out in an attentive way, because Penguin Press or any imprint now means something to consumers and to producers and editors who book coverage for our books, and for the booksellers and librarians that shelve our books. And so maintaining the identity of those imprints is really crucial. And I think so far, the corporate consolidators have had their eye on maintaining that brand identity.
You have any thoughts to offer on this whole topic from outside the corporate world, Mary?
None that would probably be useful to the panel here. No, not really.
We are running out of time. We have a couple of minutes left. Let me ask a fast question from Christy Lawrence. What is typical length of time from acceptance to publishing?
If I receive a proposal and they've given me the sample chapters, but the manuscript itself is pretty much complete, I would say on average it's a year to a year and a half before you have the finished product in your hand, because we have to go through all the steps. You've got your editor's review, the outside review, approval by the board, copy editing, production. It takes a while.
Yeah, and it varies, but in my case, it can be several years. It's not uncommon to set a delivery date for a full after I make an acquisition based on a proposal. It's not uncommon to give an author 18 months, 2 years, sometimes more, to actually write the manuscript. It depends a lot on what kind of research is required. And after that, that's just when when the manuscript comes into me for the first time, that's just when the editorial process begins in terms of my really focused work with the author, and that can be a matter of months.
And how important, how much do you care if the author misses the deadline?
It depends a lot on the subject of the book, because if we are trying to publish the book at a particular time because of what's going on in the world or some relevant anniversary or whatnot, that timing is a lot more important. But in those cases, I've probably been a lot more vigilant about checking in with the author along the way to make sure that they're on track for that time frame, if our publication strategy really depends on publishing at a particular time. But I would say that most books don't fit that description, and our goal is to get the book to the best possible version of itself and publish it when it's ready. So as an editor, I'm obliged to say deadlines are very important, and all writers should respect them. But the most important thing is getting it right. And as you might imagine, in the last 2 years, a lot of deadlines have been pushed back because of pandemic professional changes or childcare or whatever the case may be.
Lack of archives. A lot of things were
Or,
closed.
yeah, inability to do research and reporting. Yeah, absolutely. So, we try to work with the author and not be punitive.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think this has been a great discussion. I think you were both very thoughtful and informative, and I think I got a lot out of this, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So it looks like we are at our cutoff time here, 4:01. So with that, let me thank everybody, Mary and Emily, for a great session and all the wonderful questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone for the great questions.
You. Thanks, Max. Thanks.
And if you ever have academic publishing questions, feel free to email me. So thanks. Bye.